Breaking: Nancy Guthrie DNA evidence found and D4VD arrested overnight. Why was the arrest made?
Tucson and California, a bombshell arrest in the disappearance and death. Handcuffed, arrested, behind bars. Good evening. I'm Nancy Grace. This is Crime Stories. I want to thank you for being with us.
Breaking news tonight from Tucson and California. The investigation involving Nancy Guthrie and D4VD, David Anthony Burke, has taken a major new turn. Late-night reports confirm a man was detained south of Tucson during an ongoing FBI-led operation, while new DNA evidence has reportedly been recovered in connection with the Nancy Guthrie case. At the same time, authorities have confirmed that D4VD has been arrested overnight, marking a significant development in a case that has remained under intense investigation for months. What makes this situation more important is the location. The same area where law enforcement previously carried out a large SWAT operation that did not lead to any arrest at the time. Now, investigators are back, but this time with new forensic evidence and a very different level of urgency. Officials are not revealing what triggered the sudden action, and the key question right now is simple: what new evidence changed everything overnight in the Nancy Guthrie and D4VD investigation? To understand why the recent developments involving Nancy Guthrie and D4VD, David Anthony Burke, have triggered such intense attention, we need to go back to the beginning of this investigation, when very little was known, and every step forward seemed to raise more questions than answers. The case began as a missing person investigation involving Nancy Guthrie, a situation that quickly escalated beyond a routine report. Early on, law enforcement described the circumstances as active and evolving, a phrase often used when investigators believe there is more happening behind the scenes than what has been publicly confirmed. From the beginning, the challenge was clarity. Different timelines were reported. Witness accounts did not always match, and physical evidence was limited, which made it difficult for investigators to form a complete picture of what had happened and when. Despite these challenges, law enforcement agencies moved quickly. Search operations were launched across multiple areas, including regions south of Tucson that would later become central to the investigation. Teams conducted interviews, reviewed surveillance footage, and attempted to reconstruct the final known movements connected to the case. At one point, the investigation escalated significantly. A large-scale SWAT deployment was carried out in a targeted area. Armored vehicles, tactical units, and negotiation teams were all involved. The scale of that operation suggested investigators believed they were close to a breakthrough. But what followed surprised many. No arrests were made, no suspects were officially confirmed, and no detailed explanation was provided to the public. The operation ended quietly, leaving behind confusion and speculation about whether critical intelligence had been missed or misinterpreted. For several weeks after that, the case appeared to slow down publicly. Updates became less frequent. Official statements were limited, and to outside observers, it seemed as though the investigation had lost momentum. However, internally, the situation was different. Sources suggest that while public communication decreased, investigative work continued at a steady pace. Detectives focused heavily on digital evidence. Phone records were analyzed in greater detail. Communication logs, messaging patterns, and location data were reviewed and re-evaluated. This phase of the investigation is often where cases either collapse or begin to rebuild. In this instance, it appears to have done the latter. During this time, the name D4VD, David Anthony Burke, began appearing more consistently within investigative discussions. Initially, his involvement was not clearly defined. He was not publicly labeled as a suspect at that stage, but rather as an individual of interest connected to certain aspects of the timeline under review. Investigators reportedly examined his communications and movements during the period relevant to Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. While no immediate conclusions were announced, certain inconsistencies were identified that required further analysis. At the same time, forensic teams continued processing physical evidence collected earlier in the investigation. Some of this evidence required advanced testing, which can take weeks or even months depending on complexity and laboratory capacity. What is important to understand is that in complex investigations like this, evidence does not always produce immediate answers. Sometimes, the significance of a sample only becomes clear after it is compared against new data or reanalyzed using updated methods. That appears to be what happened here. After a period of relative silence, new developments began to surface behind the scenes. Additional forensic analysis reportedly produced results that prompted investigators to revisit earlier conclusions. Certain items that had previously been considered inconclusive were re-examined with updated techniques. This is often where investigations take a turning point, not because of a single dramatic discovery, but because multiple smaller pieces begin to connect. Still, none of this was made public at the time. Then came the shift. Late-night activity south of Tucson indicated renewed law enforcement presence in a specific area tied to earlier stages of the investigation. Unlike the previous SWAT operation, this time there was no large public escalation. No visible tactical buildup. Instead, operations were conducted quietly and with precision. Within hours, reports confirmed that a man had been detained for questioning. Almost simultaneously, information began circulating about a new forensic development, specifically DNA evidence that had been recovered and processed through FBI channels. This is a critical point in the investigation, because DNA evidence carries a different level of weight compared to other forms of evidence. While digital records and witness statements can be interpreted in multiple ways, DNA provides a biological link that is far more direct. It can place individuals in specific locations or connect them to specific objects or environments in ways that are difficult to dispute. However, what has not been confirmed publicly is exactly what this DNA matched, where it was found, or how it directly connects to the individuals now under investigation. That lack of detail has created even more speculation. At the center of that speculation is D4VD, David Anthony Burke, whose name has now re-emerged in connection with the latest developments. Reports confirming his arrest overnight have intensified public interest and raised questions about whether his detention is directly linked to the Nancy Guthrie investigation or part of a broader, interconnected case structure. Authorities have not clarified whether these developments stem from a single investigative thread or multiple overlapping inquiries that have now converged. What is known is that multiple agencies are now actively involved. FBI forensic teams are reportedly handling key evidence analysis. Local law enforcement is cooperating closely with federal investigators, and communication between departments has increased significantly in recent days. This level of coordination typically indicates that investigators believe they are approaching a critical juncture in the case. Yet despite this activity, official statements remain limited, and that leads to the central question still unanswered. Why did this case remain relatively quiet for weeks, only to suddenly escalate into arrests, DNA confirmation, and renewed urgency almost overnight? As of now, investigators are not providing that answer. But what is clear is that the structure of this case has shifted, and whatever evidence has been uncovered behind the scenes has now forced the investigation back into motion. As the investigation into Nancy Guthrie and D4VD, David Anthony Burke, moves into its most critical phase, attention has now shifted from background activity to one central element that appears to have changed everything: new forensic evidence, specifically DNA linked to the case. According to sources familiar with the investigation, this DNA evidence did not come from a single obvious breakthrough moment. Instead, it appears to be the result of extended forensic work, multiple samples, multiple locations, and repeated analysis over time. What makes this development significant is not just the presence of DNA itself, but the timing of its confirmation. After weeks of limited public updates, investigators suddenly escalated their actions, suggesting that the evidence reached a level of reliability strong enough to justify immediate operational response. At this stage, officials have not publicly confirmed the exact nature of the DNA, whether it came from a residence, a vehicle, clothing, or another type of recovered material. However, the FBI's involvement in processing the sample indicates that the evidence was treated as high priority from the moment it was identified. In complex investigations like this, DNA can serve multiple roles. It can place an individual at a specific location. It can confirm contact between people or objects, or it can eliminate alternative theories that investigators may have been considering for weeks or months. But what makes this case particularly sensitive is that the DNA evidence reportedly required advanced analysis techniques, including methods used in modern forensic genealogy and high-resolution profiling. This is where the investigation becomes more technical. Traditional DNA analysis often relies on full or partial genetic profiles that can be matched against existing databases. However, in cases where samples are limited, degraded, or partial, investigators may turn to more advanced techniques such as SNP analysis, single nucleotide polymorphism testing. This method allows forensic teams to extract usable information even from small or compromised biological traces. If that is what is being used here, it suggests that the evidence may have been difficult to interpret at first, requiring deeper computational analysis before meaningful conclusions could be drawn. At the same time, investigators have reportedly been reviewing digital evidence alongside the forensic findings. This includes communication records, messaging data, and location-based information that may help establish timelines and interactions between individuals connected to the case. This is where D4VD becomes increasingly relevant. While his exact legal status has not been fully detailed in public statements, sources confirm that he was detained overnight following renewed investigative activity. His arrest has not been officially linked in detail to the DNA evidence, but the timing of both developments has raised significant questions about whether the two are directly connected. Investigators are believed to be examining whether digital communications align with physical evidence recovered during the forensic phase. In modern investigations, this combination, DNA plus digital data, is often what transforms suspicion into formal charges. However, officials are remaining cautious. No detailed breakdown of the evidence has been released, and law enforcement agencies have avoided confirming specific interpretations of the DNA results. Adding to the complexity is the fact that multiple labs appear to be involved in the analysis process. While local forensic units initially handled parts of the investigation, the FBI is now reportedly overseeing critical portions of the evidence review. This shift is important. When federal agencies take control of forensic analysis, it often indicates that the case has reached a level of seriousness requiring centralized coordination, especially when evidence may be used in federal or high-profile state-level proceedings. Meanwhile, investigators have also been re-examining earlier findings from the initial phase of the case. Items that were previously considered inconclusive are now being reassessed in light of the new DNA results. This type of re-evaluation is common when a single breakthrough suddenly changes how all previous evidence is interpreted. And this may explain why earlier operations, including the SWAT deployment near Tucson, did not produce immediate results. At the time, investigators may not have had access to the forensic clarity they now appear to have. Another critical aspect of this phase is the reported coordination between agencies. FBI units, local law enforcement, and forensic specialists are now working more closely than before, suggesting that the investigation is entering a consolidation stage, where separate pieces of evidence are being connected into a single narrative. Still, despite this coordination, one major detail remains undisclosed: what exactly the DNA proves. This unanswered question is driving much of the public speculation. Does the DNA place a suspect at a specific location connected to Nancy Guthrie? Does it confirm contact between individuals now under investigation? Or does it contradict earlier assumptions made during the initial phase of the case? Until officials release more details, those questions remain open. What is clear, however, is that the investigative posture has changed. Authorities are no longer in a purely reactive phase. Instead, they appear to be actively building a structured case based on converging lines of evidence: biological, digital, and testimonial. And in cases like this, that convergence is often the point where investigations move from uncertainty toward legal action. As pressure builds and more information becomes sealed within official channels, one thing is becoming increasingly apparent. This is no longer a case defined by missing pieces. It is now a case defined by new connections being uncovered faster than they can be publicly explained. And that leads directly into the next phase of the investigation, where those connections begin to trigger real-world consequences, including arrests, legal filings, and potential witness involvement that could reshape everything we thought we knew. The investigation into Nancy Guthrie and D4VD, David Anthony Burke, has now reached its most intense and unpredictable phase yet, where evidence is no longer just being analyzed behind closed doors, but is actively shaping real-world law enforcement action. Following the emergence of new DNA findings and renewed FBI involvement, authorities escalated their operation late overnight in what sources describe as a coordinated, high-priority enforcement action south of Tucson. Unlike earlier stages of the investigation, this time there was no large public buildup, no announced press briefing, no visible tactical staging hours in advance. Instead, law enforcement moved quietly, with precision timing and limited exposure. By early morning, reports confirmed that a man had been detained for questioning in connection with the ongoing investigation. Almost simultaneously, attention shifted toward D4VD, David Anthony Burke, whose arrest was confirmed in a separate but rapidly developing law enforcement operation. While officials have not publicly provided a detailed breakdown of charges at this stage, the timing of his detention alongside the new forensic developments has triggered widespread speculation about his direct connection to the latest evidence. This is where the investigation becomes more complex and more sensitive, because in high-profile cases like this, arrests are rarely made in isolation. They are typically the result of multiple converging factors: forensic evidence, digital records, witness statements, and investigative reconstruction, all aligning to a point where law enforcement believes legal thresholds have been met. And that appears to be what is happening now. One of the most discussed elements of this case is the presence of DNA evidence confirmed by FBI channels. While officials have not publicly disclosed the exact source or match, investigators reportedly believe it plays a central role in establishing a clearer timeline of events connected to Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. However, DNA alone does not typically explain motive. It does not always explain intent. And it does not always tell the full story of what happened. That is where additional investigative layers come in. Sources indicate that investigators have also been analyzing digital communications, including messaging data and device activity linked to individuals connected to the case. In modern investigations, this type of data can reveal movement patterns, communication frequency, and potential coordination between multiple parties. When combined with forensic evidence, digital trails can either strengthen or contradict witness accounts. And in this case, it appears investigators are using both to build a more complete reconstruction of events. This is also where theories begin to emerge, but cautiously within investigative boundaries. Some analysts suggest that the combination of DNA and digital evidence may point toward a chain of events that investigators were not fully able to confirm in the early stages of the case. Others believe that a key witness may have come forward, providing information that helped connect previously unrelated pieces of evidence. However, law enforcement has not confirmed any single theory publicly. What they have confirmed is cooperation between multiple agencies, including the FBI and local law enforcement units. That level of coordination often indicates that investigators are preparing for a significant procedural step, whether that is formal charging, grand jury presentation, or expanded suspect questioning. Meanwhile, the arrest of D4VD has added a new layer of public scrutiny. While initial statements from legal representatives suggest denial of wrongdoing, investigators appear to be focusing on a broader evidentiary picture rather than a single isolated incident. In many complex investigations, prosecutors build cases using a combination of physical evidence, behavioral patterns, and corroborated witness accounts. And this case appears to be no different. One of the most striking aspects of this development is how quickly the situation escalated once the DNA results were reportedly confirmed. Within hours, law enforcement activity increased. Within a short window of time, detentions were made. And by morning, media outlets were reporting a significant shift in the investigation's direction. That speed suggests something important. Investigators may have reached a point where delaying action was no longer viable. In legal terms, that often happens when evidence crosses a threshold of reliability that supports probable cause for arrest or further detention. But even with arrests made, many critical questions remain unanswered. Was the DNA directly linked to Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, or does it represent a secondary connection that helps reconstruct movement and contact patterns? Did digital evidence confirm interactions between individuals now under investigation? Or did a witness statement provide the missing context that tied everything together? At this stage, officials are not confirming. What they are doing instead is maintaining operational silence, something often seen when investigations are transitioning from evidence gathering to prosecution strategy. Meanwhile, public reaction has intensified, with speculation growing about what investigators knew internally before making their move. The earlier SWAT operation near Tucson is now being re-examined in hindsight, with some suggesting that law enforcement may have acted on incomplete intelligence at that time. If true, that could explain why the earlier operation did not produce arrests while the current phase did. Another key development is the reported involvement of multiple forensic laboratories, including FBI-level analysis units. When evidence is escalated to federal laboratories, it often indicates that the findings are either highly sensitive, legally significant, or require specialized analysis beyond local capabilities. This reinforces the idea that the investigation is now operating at a much higher level of scrutiny. And as each layer of this case unfolds, one thing becomes increasingly clear. This is no longer a simple missing person inquiry. It has evolved into a multi-layered criminal investigation involving forensic science, digital evidence, and coordinated law enforcement action across jurisdictions. Yet despite all of this progress, the central mystery remains intact. What exactly was uncovered in the DNA evidence that triggered this chain reaction? And why did it take months of silence before the investigation suddenly shifted into full motion? As investigators continue building their case, those answers remain locked behind sealed reports and undisclosed findings. But based on the speed of recent developments, one conclusion is becoming harder to ignore. Something was found that fundamentally changed how this entire case is being understood. And whatever that is, it has already led to arrests, federal involvement, and a level of urgency that suggests the investigation is far from over. Because now, authorities are no longer just asking what happened. They are working to prove it. As this investigation into Nancy Guthrie and D4VD, David Anthony Burke, continues to develop, one thing is clear: this case is no longer sitting in silence. It is moving fast, and every new detail is changing the direction of the story. From a missing person report to FBI DNA analysis to overnight detentions and arrests, this investigation has now entered a phase where answers are starting to surface, but many of the most important questions are still unanswered. And that is exactly why the story is not over yet. Authorities are still not releasing full details about the DNA evidence, and investigators have not officially confirmed how every piece of evidence connects. That means the next update could completely change everything we think we know right now. If you are following this case, stay alert, because developments like this don't happen in isolation. One new report can open an entirely new direction of investigation. One witness statement can shift the entire timeline, and one forensic result can redefine what investigators believed for months. The case of Nancy Guthrie deserves answers. And as the investigation expands, pressure is increasing on law enforcement to provide clarity, evidence, and accountability. Meanwhile, the arrest of D4VD has only added more urgency and more public attention to what happens next. We will continue following every update, every report, and every confirmed detail as it becomes available. If you want to stay updated on this investigation, make sure you subscribe, turn on notifications, and stay connected for the next developments as they break. Because in cases like this, truth doesn't arrive all at once. It comes piece by piece until everything finally fits together.